I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Micheal Levin to his fourth appearance at an American Renaissance Conference. As you all know, he's certainly best known in our circles for his writing and his public speaking on race and IQ differences. His book, Why Race Matters, was one of those rare volumes to earn a front-page review in American Renaissance. I tell you, publishers vie for that honor. Of course, by the time the book actually appeared, Professor Levin was one of the favorite demons of the liberal left. He was called all the usual names, hate monger, bigot. My favorite was someone who wrote, I believe, in the New York Post, that Professor Levin was a horse's ass. Now, isn't that an eloquent refutation of years of data gathering to call Professor Levin a horse's ass? That's typical of the way the other side responds to arguments that they cannot understand and cannot refute. I remember very well, I once visited Professor Levin at his office, and I had to sit aside while he had a more pressing and important engagement, and that was a black girl in his, black student in his class of symbolic logic had shown up wanting last-minute cramming and help before the examination. So there was the famous bigot and hater and horse's ass carefully and patiently teaching this black woman symbolic logic because she was desperate to pass her examination. This, of course, is not the sort of image that anyone on the other side could even conceive of, much less understand. Professor Levin has made something of a career of puncturing liberal illusions. Before I had even heard of him in terms of race, he wrote a book on feminism that was called Feminism and Freedom. The Wall Street Journal called it severe, systematic, and utterly convincing. Well, when I read it, I thought so too, and I wrote Professor Levin a fan letter, and that is how we first got acquainted, even before he had released the stink bomb on the race and IQ question. Professor Levin has also written a book about homosexuality that punctures a number of illusions on the left. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Levin, who will speak about the question of reparations for blacks.
Can I borrow your watch to keep track of the time? Okay. The wake of 9/11 has pushed reparations back from their position halfway to the mainstream. At present, urging even warranted entitlements is seen as piggish. Still, reparations hardly lie beached on yonder bank. As normalcy returns, blacks and their allies will renew demands for vast sums to compensate misdeeds, real or imaginary. The New York City Council recently voted to study the question. Whites must be ready to reply. To judge by polls, to be sure, reparations are opposed by most whites. But they must be opposed for the right reason, not merely as inopportune or overblown, but as an outrageous expression of ingratitude and gall. Unless whites can articulate the right case against reparations, they will end by watching in bewildered impotence the installment of measures they know to be wrong, as they did in the case of affirmative action. Replies to reparations may be graded by power to shock. Some might be heard on 60 Minutes. Others would be shushed, and others still call down execration as racist. Unfortunately, all the publicly allowed arguments concede too much, which leaves only the forbidden ones worth considering. So let us divide objections into the polite, the impolitic, the rude, and the shocking. The commonest polite argument is that reparations cost too much. A sound enough point as far as it goes, given the rapacity of the civil rights lobby. Sources I have seen put the debt to American blacks at several trillion dollars each. I don't think they really understand these numbers. One ever-handy estimator that yields these remarkable figures is the race difference in economic outcome. There are many. That is automatically ascribed to discrimination rather than market forces or, the same thing, ability differences. Thus, Ebony grounds reparations on, and I quote, a study out of the University of California at Berkeley that showed that the value of the income lost as a consequence of racial discrimination between 1929 and 1969 alone comes to $1.6 trillion. Whites, end of quote. Whites, of course, beg for such finger-pointing by constantly rehearsing their past sins. A second type of estimate looks to precedents. Notably, the $60,000, I believe it is, paid by the U.S. government to each Nisai interned during World War II. $60,000 for 35 million American blacks, alleged to have suffered far more, comes to $2.1 trillion. Similar calculations cite German payments to Jewish Holocaust survivors, whose dominance in the victim sweepstake irks many blacks greatly. A third formula treats the average price of a slave 200 years ago, about $14,000 in current dollars, as stolen human capital on which interest has steadily been compounding. Given a modest 3% annual interest rate corresponding to economic growth, in this case, reparationists will doubtless be generous about the bounty of the free market, as opposed to attacking capitalism, each slave's estate is $2.8 million short. For every million Africans enslaved, their current descendants are thereby collectively owed $2.8 trillion. The debt to continental Africa runs higher still, to cover removal of natural resources as well as the labor of 15 to an implausible 100 million abductees. Never mentioned is the culpability of fellow Africans in the slave trade, who should in consistency be asked to pay reparations also, or the unavailability of natural resources such as oil and diamonds to indigenous technology. Notwithstanding, white depredations are said to have cost Africa $7 trillion, for a total bill typically greater than $10 trillion. Bear in mind that all the goods produced and services provided in the U.S. last year were worth roughly $9 trillion, which in turn represented nearly 1/4 of total world output. Reparationists thus in effect demand that American whites work solely for blacks for a year or more, or that the whole white race carry that burden for a good part of the year. I mean, abstruse questions about should Asians play a role don't usually arise. My wife once proposed this bargain. Whites give blacks as large a lump sum as they want in exchange for a promise never to ask for more or say another word about whites, racism, slavery, or the rest of the litany. Tempting. But I'll suggest later why the black end of this deal would be hard to keep. And anyway, no society could survive the diversion of so much energy at one go. Unfortunately, pressing the cost button too hard prompts an obvious question. What if whites could afford it? If whites can cite only poverty on their own behalf, then should their apparently boundless productivity and inventiveness someday make payment possible, pay they must. A plea of poverty admits the debt, and once the reparation principle is admitted, all that remains to discuss is the payment schedule, to be arranged perhaps by complicitous white accountants. Perhaps each white could work for blacks 2 weeks annually for 25 years. In shifts to minimize economic shock. Perhaps blacks could be relieved of taxation for a few centuries. No. Whites simply disarm themselves by whining that they are a little short. although reputable white opinion may be counted on to fall into this trap for fear of saying anything more offensive. So in other words, I think it is a mistake tactically to press the cost issue. It concedes too much. We had better turn to less polite objections. Under this head fall requests for specifics, where reparationists are vague, chiefly about who is going to pay and for just what. Is it to be the federal government, state government, individuals, or whom? There are vast problems with assessing individuals, particularly those whose ancestors owned no slaves. How have blacks been harmed by a New Englander whose family had always done its bit for what they used to call civil rights, or by anyone whose grandparents came to the United States in 1920? It is impossible to calculate the gains even of indirect beneficiaries of slavery. Take a man whose grandfather clerked in a store that in another department sold shirts made with cotton harvested by sharecroppers. Surely he owes less than descendants of slaveholders, but how much less? Supposing it determined somehow that, let's say, half of Grandpa's salary was tainted by slavery, but that wise investments increased his wealth 20-fold, do his heirs owe half their holdings to blacks or just 1/40th? Now, these seem like very abstruse questions, but reparationists are obliged to answer these murky questions because the damages they demand are compensatory, not punitive. Slaveholders and other wrongdoers are no longer alive to be penalized. A present-day white, having harmed no one, owes at most what he has gained from wrongs done by others. It's not punitive. So tallying his his debt demands detailed case-wide knowledge of what he, in particular, has gained. No one has this information. And the longer ago the wrong, the less accessible it becomes. Because individual fault is imponderable, reparationists tend to look to, quote, government to pay. But then they face the issue mentioned earlier, of which governments it is to be. The states seem the natural targets, since their laws regulated slavery and subsequently segregation. Indeed, the federal government initiated the actions that ended slavery, overrode state segregation, and eventually came to require favoritism for blacks. And it hardly seems cricket to foist the bill for damages on the party that tried hardest to stop them. But which states, then, should pay? Surely not those that banned slavery or entered the Union after it ended. And then you get into complicated questions like, well, what about when they were territories? Is a state the same as it was when it was a territory, or did one entity cease to exist and the other start to exist? Very difficult questions. The best candidates are as sort of the usual suspects, are the members of the old Confederacy. But apart from the shallowness of their pockets, once again, many of their current residents, the taxpayers who would foot the bill, have no connection to past wrongs. For these reasons, one may expect reparationists to discover sooner or later that the debt is a, quote, national problem, which, quote, all Americans must solve together. That happened in the case of the Civil Rights Act. Regional issues suddenly became nationalized. But however the scope issue is disposed of, there is a second. Is a government, local, state, or federal, responsible for what it does, or also for what it merely permits by failing to outlaw? The distinction is important because most of the practices for which repayment is demanded, namely slavery and discrimination in jobs and housing, were private. Antebellum governments neither owned slaves nor forced anyone to buy them. They simply allowed ownership. Likewise, while some states did segregate some of their own institutions, for instance schools, and mandate some private segregation, for instance on trains, much of the discrimination reparationists decry was undertaken by private individuals using their properties in ways consistent with but not required by law. Government is to blame for damage these practices caused only if it is government's fault that private individuals took the opportunities offered. One might defend a wide view of government responsibility on the grounds that government must protect rights actively by preventing others from breaching them, as well as respecting them itself, just as a night watchman must not only refrain from beating up passers-by himself, but also keep passers-by from beating each other up. There is something to the idea that permitting great wrongs is state negligence, but it can be taken too far. There is, to begin with, the general presumption against post facto judgment. Normally, no entity is held to account for what was legal when done, as were slavery and discrimination. What would reparationists say if states a century from now were fined for once having allowed private corporations to discriminate against whites? Presumably they would say the states were not responsible. Even waiving the general case against post facto guilt, not every private misdeed is guilty failure to prevent. Vandals, not the city, are responsible for defacing a neighbor's wall, although stationing a policeman on every corner would have stopped them. A line must be drawn somewhere, beyond which governments are innocent of the abuses of the freedoms they allow. Finally, even if states are held to absurdly strict standards today for what happened way back then, they may still be innocent of most of the acts for which they are retrospectively scolded, because these acts were themselves quite innocent. Slavery, discrimination in jobs, housing, and service, and social stigma are usually lumped together into one ugly pile to which government, whatever that may be, turned a blind eye. In fact, these are quite distinct. Slavery does infringe rights that any government should protect, although once again, back pay for recently manumitted slaves is owed only by their former owners, who are kind of scarce on the ground now. But it is hard to see the right violated by, for instance, refusal to hire blacks. The limit an employer sets to the freedom of blacks to contract with him is presumably covered by his own right to free association. The blacks he refuses to hire are no worse off than they would have been had he not existed. So how does he harm them? Since laws against private discrimination, therefore, may well be wrong and there be nothing objectionable about private discrimination, governments were hardly remiss for not passing them sooner. So they certainly don't obviously owe reparations for not passing them. Still another precept reparationists ignore is that not every beneficiary of a harm must help repair the victim. This is a very important point that is usually completely ignored in discussions of these matters. Once whites are thought to be shown to benefit, it kind of follows automatically that they should pay up. But from the premise that today's whites are richer than today's blacks because of slavery, which we may grant for now because we don't want to be rude yet, it does not follow that today's whites owe today's blacks anything. A couple of examples make this clear. Suppose Smith and Jones own the only two restaurants in town. A firebug torches Smith's place, causing Jones's business to improve. So long as Jones had no hand in or prior knowledge of the arson, he owes Smith nothing. The recent terrorist attack on New York is another example. That's prompted some businesses to move to New Jersey. Yet no one thinks New Jersey owes New York reparations, unless New Jersey in some way is connected with Al-Qaeda. Actually, come to think of it, yeah. I hadn't quite thought of that when I wrote this example. So far as New Jersey is concerned, or the parts of it outside that little town where hijackers were, the attack might as well have been an earthquake or other stroke of bad luck which disadvantaged the competitor. Just as far as Jones is concerned, Smith's fire might as well have been a kitchen accident. Note the irrelevance of the arsonist's motives, whether he did it from psychosis, a desire for gain, admiration of Jones, hatred of Smith, racial hatred of Smith. Jones is innocent. Assuming that today's whites have benefited from racially motivated wrongs, white beneficiaries to be liable must have abetted those wrongs, failed to stop them, or at least culpably ignored them. Showing this is too heavy a burden for reparations to carry, since the disputed wrongs, particularly slavery, took place before most whites were alive. As a kind of aside, apropos white supposed enjoyment of the or undercompensated fruits of black labor is the frequent claim that, quote, blacks built America. This is patently untrue. At no time have blacks been more than 1/10 of the US population, and until World War II, they lived largely in the rural South. They were a part of Southern agriculture, but played virtually no role in the development of the large cities, industrial complexes, universities, and public projects that support American prosperity. They did not contribute disproportionately to science, medicine, or technology. America would have been different without blacks, but not noticeably poorer. Aside from this important historical note, the demand for payments to repair blacks calls to mind a larger issue that also arose about quotas. It seemed unfair to pass over young whites in favor of less qualified blacks who allegedly would have been more qualified in a just world, when the whites were themselves not to blame for the blacks' substandard qualifications. I mean, we all remember that point being made. In fact, the two issues, reparations and quotas, and the arguments pro and con, are one issue, as indeed the whole reparation debate recapitulates the one over affirmative action. It is a familiar tune, an old standard transposed to a slightly different key. And that remark leads us to rude questions. I'm starting to get over the line here. Unacceptable in good company. Weren't quotas supposed to be reparative? Didn't Jimmy Carter call affirmative action, quote, compensatory discrimination back in 1975? Wasn't that what quotas were all about? Didn't we have this conversation 40 years ago? Reparationists suffer from convenient historical myopia. Compare these words of Lyndon Johnson, 1964. I read, "You do not take a person who has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others." Compare those words to Randall Robinson writing in 2000. "No nation can enslave a group of people for hundreds of years, set them free, bedraggled and penniless, pit them without assistance in a hostile environment against privileged victimizers, and then reasonably expect the gap between the heirs of the two groups to narrow." Verbosity aside, Robinson's metaphor is the same. Affirmative action was to make blacks whole by restoring the position they should have had at life's starting line, just as reparations are. And because quotas did become the order of the day, whatever trillions blacks are owed, they have gotten. By the early 1990s, quotas are estimated to cost $200 billion yearly, and have no doubt become more expensive with wider and deeper entrenchment. Some portion of this cost is the sheer inefficiency incurred by finding, training, and enduring the errors of inapt blacks. But much income is transferred. For instance, there are more than 1 million blacks enrolled in American colleges, virtually all of whom, to judge by the data that has emerged from reverse discrimination cases at the U of Texas, U of Michigan, and elsewhere, occupy positions that have been denied to abler whites. In this way, the life prospects of whites forced to attend inferior institutions have been exchanged with those of blacks admitted ahead of them, although one must adjust for the probable failure of blacks to exploit these niches as well as the abler whites would have, and get into kind of complicated questions of just how much that is. But one can add that giving a black a better job than any equally qualified white could obtain achieves a similar transfer effect. Reasonable assumptions about the value of a college degree and the relative value of degrees from more and less prestigious institutions suggest that quotas transfer billions of dollars annually. As quotas have been enforced for over 30 years, they have already accounted for a good chunk of any reparations owed. Nor are quotas the only correcting factor. However centralized or decentralized, public relief of indigents, welfare, remains a fact of life. And blacks fall below the threshold that triggers it 3 to 4 times more often than whites do. White taxpayers annually give blacks tens of billions of dollars. In my book, Why Race Matters, I point out that black slums receive a Marshall Plan about once every 3 years. A rate, they're always calling for a Marshall Plan for the slums, a rate that every few decades pays off another $1 trillion of debt. Growing still ruder, not yet shocking, one may also subtract from any debt the cost to whites of black crime. Blacks commit about 2/3 of all robberies in the U.S., half of which, about 300,000 at current rates, victimize whites. White-on-black crime is, of course, rare. Since blacks commit felonies at 7 to 10 times the white rate, this means that there occur each year several 100,000 robberies from which an all-white society would be free, and which give blacks resources properly belonging to whites. Now, I've heard the argument that welfare and crime victimization were never intended, hence do not count as regress. True. But still, insofar as they shrink the gap between what blacks deserve and what they have, they tend to balance the scales. Suppose I obliviously smash your Ming vase. Then, out of generosity, rather than a desire to make you whole, I give you an equally valuable Ming vase for Valentine's Day. Surely you could not demand another one on the grounds that I still hadn't paid for the one I broke. You'd like an admission of guilt, but really, I owe you nothing. You are a vase the worse thanks to me. Thanks to me, you are also a vase the better. You are where you were at the outset, relieving me of any burden. Or suppose, after I break your vase, you steal my car. It does not matter whether your intent was to retaliate for the vase, to extract payment, or you just like my car. You have reduced the bill for a vase by the cost of a car. I trust the analogies with welfare and crime are clear. Although rude, these reminders of the unclarity of what did what to whom, the gap between luck and liability, the flow of wealth from whites to blacks will fall on deaf ears. Reparations are déjà vu all over again. And none of these points, apt though they were, had the appropriate impact on quotas. Why? Because they seem mere quibbles in the face of the stark, overwhelming race difference in wealth. Blacks here or in Africa are so thoroughly behind whites anywhere that there must be a reason. And what can that be but white theft? So many people find this inference obvious, or say they do, that the fact of white guilt goes without saying. And once white guilt is assumed, the only open question is how whites should expunge it. Quotas, money, both. The issue of black poverty must be faced squarely, for no subtleties about fault will save whites from themselves once they see themselves as in the wrong, given their superego, I guess. Hence the need to shock by bringing up the race differences that were also forbidden in the quota debate. It must be insisted that blacks are known to be on average less intelligent than whites, and that this is almost certainly why they are on average poorer. As Professor Lin has recently documented, what nobody doubts, national wealth tracks national IQ, as individual wealth tracks individual IQ. There is no mystery here. Things people want sometimes occur naturally, but most wealth is created by transforming nature. The ability to transform nature requires insight into its works, and a higher IQ affords greater insight. Whites' higher IQ allows them to make a greater quantity and greater variety of more desirable things. That's why whites are richer. As all AR readers know, the evidence is overwhelming that racial IQ differences are genetic in origin. Even non-readers of AR are beginning to sense this uneasily. The key point is to bring this to bear on reparations. That's why, much as I admire David Horowitz for his courageous, articulate advertisements, they still don't quite get to the core of the matter. And if you don't get to the core of the matter, it's not going to be effective. Reparationists will continue to wave the bloody shirt of poverty, presenting whites with a stark intellectual choice. Agree that poverty is caused by white sin and pay up, or find a better explanation. Biology is the better explanation that must be deployed. That whites will do anything to deny home truths about race is not news. But I believe that a desire to avoid these same truths plays an important but ill-understood role in the minds of reparationists. And I think it would be a mistake to dismiss them glibly as racial racketeers who are just in it for the buck. So I don't have any channel to Jesse Jackson's mind, but I'm going to suggest a hypothesis about what may be going on in some people's minds. People tend to treat symptoms as causes, often to the point of seeking to create the symptoms of a desirable condition to convince themselves that the condition itself exists. For instance, were an endogenous chemical that confers immunity to cancer also found to cause freckles, guess what most people would do? They would start examining their skin very carefully for freckles. A great many would stand in the sun for a long time in the hope that freckles would appear. They might paint freckles on themselves and kind of talk themselves into the paint can spilled accidentally. I must be prone to freckles, therefore proving that I must be immune to cancer. Finding freckles might come to seem very urgent, just as people planning a picnic find it urgent that the arrows on the TV weather map point the right way, right? And we do think that way. I suspect that reparationists and other racial partisans invert the order of injury and desert in just this way. In the real world, injury is the basis, the cause of liability. It goes like this: A is okay, B injures A, B owes A. Clear enough. So to speak, the debt is a symptom of the injury. It doesn't cause the injury. But now imagine our long-suffering Jones. Restaurant's been burned down. He's in an ambiguous situation. He is not doing well. He doesn't know why, but he fears the cause may be an intrinsic defect. In this state of mind, he may well succumb to inversion and search for someone who owes him reparations as evidence that he was injured. He says to himself, I'm owed, so someone must have hurt me. So my sorry state must be someone else's fault. So I must be okay. I suspect this mechanism may be what sustains the odd intensification of black demands in the face of constant white concession. To avoid the conclusion that there is something wrong with them, blacks keep convincing themselves that their failures are someone else's fault. And to keep themselves convinced that their failures are someone else's fault, they convince themselves that somebody owes them for what it did to them. Again, if somebody owes me, it can't be me. This is why concessions are never enough. What could blacks tell themselves were their every grievance satisfied, their every claim met, and still they do not do as well as whites? The shameful conclusion would be unavoidable. To keep this fearful possibility at bay, new grievances are invented. new unmet claims, whose existence proves that their plight is not due to anything in themselves. So I think, as I draw to an end, that opposition to reparations must rest on a proper understanding not only of kind of their logical role in the case for reparations, but also on their expressive and symbolic value to those that demand them. If you don't see them this way, sort of the two sides are going to keep talking past each other. Well, thank you. Thanks, question.
Hi, Professor Levin. My name is Michael Santamara. I'm the editorial director of ReportersNotebook.com. I just wanted to ask you two questions. If a black intellectual is to tell you the following: we are allocating $100 billion to two non-starving countries, Israel and Egypt, for the next 10 years, why not redirect the money to black communities for business development? How would you feel about that?
Well, I think you have to look at the reasons for which things are asked. If it was said that the money would have some sort of profound multiplier effect on the economy, you might have a reasonable case. What you have to look at is the reasons. If the claim is because this will pay for what whites stole for blacks, and whatever we're giving anybody else, it's not justified.
You touched on Richard Lynn's research. I was fascinated by his essay that he had in Mankind Quarterly. I don't know if you read that. But as you probably know...
I stole my data, yeah.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, the black American IQ is comparable to 50% of Israelis' IQ level and comparable to 100% of India's IQ level. My understanding from reading is that a 4-point range is considered comparable. The national IQ of India is 81. The Sephardic element, which represents about 50% of Israel's IQ, is 88. And Ireland's national IQ is 93, which has the fastest growing economy in Europe. What I'm trying to get to by making these comments is that there is ways of helping black Americans in business development, because you see it with Ireland, you see it with the Sephardic community in Israel, and you see it with India, which has a large economy in the world events.
Well, once again, I would have to leave it to economists to answer the general question of how do you help blacks, if that's a reasonable goal. I'm just interested in one argument for giving money, and that's the reparations argument. There might be other reasons to do so. It might conceivably be effective. I don't know. I have my doubts, but that's an open question.
All right, thank you.
Professor, here's a little curve for you, and it's a maybe modification to your wife's idea on reparations. I might consider reparations if that would include a one-way passage over to Africa. And I'm a little rusty on my history, but are you familiar with what we did in the past regarding the creation of the country of Liberia? Was that such a situation? Would that be helpful in this context?
Well, I assume that's said with some tongue-in-cheek.
Not really. Not really.
Well, the fact is, if somebody owes you money for damages, he's not allowed to attach strings and attach conditions. If you smash somebody's car and he owes you $2,000, he's in no position to say to you, I owe you $2,000, but will you leave the neighborhood? I won't give it to you unless you leave the neighborhood. If you owe him $2,000, you owe him. The issue has to be fought on those grounds. I think once, as I say, whether or not that's meant ironically, once you concede, we owe you $100 billion, $10 trillion, but we won't give it to you unless you go away, you're conceding much too much. They can then say in reply with perfect justice, why should we go away? You owe it to us.
If the reparationists have their way and they start handing out governmental largesse should full Negroes get 100% of the largesse, mulattoes 1/2, quadroons 1/4, and octoroons 1/8 of the amount? Because a lot of times when I watch the minorities on TV, wondering about this, whenever I see a lot of the minorities on TV, you see blue-eyed black guys, and I'm wondering, is he getting the full 100%? And so I'm a little distraught over that.
Well, I wish I had thought of that point. That's just one more of the subtleties that will have to be resolved. And what about dominant versus recessive genes?
Yeah.
There was a black journalist who wrote a book out of Africa. His name escapes me, but yeah, and he spent about 3 years traveling through Africa.
Oh yes, yes.
And there's a story in the book where he was overlooking a river on a bridge. It was all the dead bodies floating down the river. And he was just wondering, who are these people? Don't they count? Don't they matter? In my country, they matter. Everyone matters. And then later on in the book, he was at the foot of a port where African slaves were deported to America as slaves. It's a destination, it's like a tourist destination. And he was listening to a lot of African Americans rail against Europeans for sending their ancestors to America as slaves. And he was just quietly wondering to himself, would he be this middle-class, well-dressed, educated black journalist as he is today, or would he be one of those bodies floating down the river if his ancestors weren't sent to America? And I'd just like to say there's ample evidence that he just might have been one of those bodies floating down the river if his ancestors didn't come to America.
Okay, there's 2 points to be made about that. I think the general situation in Africa is evidence that the plight of whites in the United States is not, the plight of blacks in the United States is not the fault of whites. The plight of whites might be the fault of whites. It's evidence that the level of income of blacks is not due to what whites have done. However, I'm a little leery of the argument that on the whole, blacks are better off in the United States than they would have been in Africa. That's probably true, but I'm not sure that completely blunts the moral point, because in deciding whether you owe somebody something, you don't generally just look at kind of the global situation, whether he's better off than he would have been in another situation. You have to start with some appropriate baseline in the situation he was in and ask himself whether he's at the baseline or above it or below it. So if you've got blacks in the United States who were held as slaves, it's arguable they're better off as slaves than they would have been had they not been abducted. Nonetheless, abduction is wrong and enslavement is wrong, and they should at the very least be freed. The question, though, now is how much of the current black situation is a consequence of that past wrong, or whether it's kind of convergence to what would have happened naturally without human intervention. And that, I think, is the important issue.
Professor Levin, it seems to me that Jewish individuals own a lot of the media and fund a lot of the politicians that make demands on behalf of the black community for things like reparations, while another group of Jewish individuals tend to take the intellectual lead in combating the initiatives that was proposed by this first group. The result being that black workers and white workers end up fighting each other, while Jewish individuals assume leadership and profit from the situation. How do you feel your remarks fit into that?
Well, apart from profiting from the situation, I think you're largely right. I don't think that the Jewish leadership on either side particularly profits. I think they're doing what they are convinced is correct. My own view, frankly, is that Jews tend to take the lead, the intellectual lead, in most movements where it's possible, and so it's not surprising that the Jews would be articulating the case for reparations, and Jews would be articulating the case.
Take the lead in issues they create. I mean, the issue didn't exist until it was created by Jewish individuals.
Well, very well. I'm inclined to agree. I'd say take the lead in civil rights, generally speaking, take the lead in opposing them.
In creating issues and dividing people.
Well, I'll speak to Steven Spielberg about it and see what I can do.
Yeah.
would point out that blacks were not forced to go to Liberia. They were given the choice, do you want to be a majority or a minority? If you choose a situation, and I would point out they make more money here than in Liberia. If you choose a situation you don't like, that's your problem.
Fair enough.
You know, I would also point out that we bled at Gettysburg, we bled at Antietam. Blacks played a very small role in building our country. We built them an entire nation state. We've paid reparations. We've already been snookered. Okay, or the debt's been paid. And I have two more questions. How do we avoid further appeasing these unreasonable minority demands? And, you know, I mean, what are some concrete political steps do you do? Do you protest? Do you write letters? Do you go on the web, or simply indulge in nonviolent disobedience? The second question I have is, how should whites, in the face of our situation, make sure that our culture and our heritage and our genes continue down the ages so that our descendants 1,000 years from now will sort of look like and talk like and act like us? How do we prevent the, I guess, deterioration?
Okay, the 4 points actually raised. Right, the offer to go to Liberia was non-coercive. It wasn't a string attached. Nonetheless, it still, I think, would be a very slippery matter to say, we'll give you reparations, and if you want, some of it can be in the form of a one-way ticket to Africa. That still concedes a lot, and it's still, if we really owe them reparations, it's not something we are in a position to say. If somebody owes you for a car, you would be annoyed if he even offered to give it sort of an in-kind exchange. You want what you're owed. How you take it should be up to you. About the Civil War, I do agree. I didn't mention that because there's just so many things you can mention. I think in particular that, as I mentioned in my book, the northern casualties and the consequences to families of northerners who were, I'm sorry, this is the way the moral scene is, who were killed or wounded in the war are to be subtracted from any debt to blacks, and that might well by itself pay off the debt. As to what to do, I mean, in a sense, that's what everybody at this conference is discussing, and certainly speakers who are involved in organizations, lobbying organizations and so on, would know much more about that than I would. I really have no constructive suggestions. My hunch is that it's going to take an event of some sort, not intellectual efforts to shift opinion. You would think that the World Trade Center would have been sufficient, but evidently we're kind of settling back to the PC normalcy again. I just don't know. Some event. I don't think it'll be an intellectual matter.
Blacks in Florida have sued the state because the schools aren't educating their children as well as they're educating the white children. This is a real case. It's in the newspapers. You can read about it. They won't stop with reparations. Of course, they started before back in the 60s and got some extra benefits from the government then. But this is a terrible thing, and if this is allowed to spread to any extent, I don't know how we'll end up. I just wanted to mention it. Did you read about that?
I know there was something like that, I believe in New York or New Jersey as well.
Oh, there are several cases.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it all sort of comes down to the same 800-pound hippopotamus in the living room that nobody wants to mention, that ultimately the state of Florida will have to make the case that the failure of black children to do as well as whites on standardized tests, I assume that's part of the evidence,
exactly, yes,
is due to an IQ difference and nothing else, and that it's not in any way, even if you assume the state is responsible for educating children and everyone should be equally educated, even if you assume all that, it's not Florida's fault. At some point, that case will have to be made or whites will continue to lose.
At some point, it'll have to be done, as
Yeah.
you say. Thank you.
In your book review of Randall Robinson's book, you made the remark that a proper balancing of the books would have blacks owing whites, and I certainly agree. Not that whites want reparations from blacks, but just philosophically speaking, what would you think of the argument, kind of turning it against blacks, that, well, Actually, whites are owed reparation when you look at black and white crime, high taxes for government programs, affirmative action, the destruction of inner cities, things like that. And as a second part of my question, if whites owe blacks for alleged misdeeds, do blacks owe whites for things that have made their lives better? When blacks get sick, they can go to hospitals rather than medicine men. When they want to go somewhere, they can take a car, a train, or a plane rather than walk. They could use computers, television, radio. You get the idea.
Yeah. Well, to a slight extent, I addressed that in this little talk. You know, it would be interesting to make that case because I think I know what some of the answers would be, and they might be useful in a sense to our side. On one hand, I think many spokesmen would say these are imponderables. Who can calculate such a matter? Then I think that would give the anti-reparation argument a powerful weapon, namely, well, who can calculate black reparations? If nobody can calculate, if the skeins of the past are all intermixed with each other, why don't we call it even and take it from here? That would be a very useful thing to happen. I think another thing that the black lobby might reply, as I indicated, is that crime and so on were not meant to as reparation, and that white generosity was not meant as reparation, so it somehow doesn't count. And then you could make the case that I made, well, it may not count, but it still balances the books. And once again, you get, if they say in reply, but these are very, very murky questions, then you can turn that back on them. Larger questions, such as how well blacks would have done with witch doctors versus hospitals. I'm not, as I say, you have to be a little careful there because granted that they live in a society that had those things, you might consider that just the baseline and not something extra that they've been given. Although on the other hand, I certainly think it should give any complainant a very bad conscience to make those complaints while sending his kids to public school and hospitals and so on.
Professor Levin, I have a question which I would like to precede by saying if a horse's ass can produce a courageous and clear presentation like you did, I would like to be a horse's ass too. Essentially, if I may paraphrase what you said, one of the things that you said was that today's whites do not owe today's blacks anything. I would like to know from you if you would be willing to apply that same principle to the generations of Germans that are expected apparently from here to eternity to pay reparation to the Jews, particularly in view of the fact that according to Professor Finkelstein, most of that money doesn't even end up in the pockets of the deserving Jew, but in those of the big organizations.
Well, even if every penny ended up where it's intended to go, I think obviously that at some point liability ends. I think you can safely say that when nobody alive in 1945 is alive now, then Germany should stop paying, and the same for Jewish recipients of it. Sure. I don't know exactly where to draw the line, but certainly whites, giving the black argument everything, whites and blacks have passed that point decades ago.
I don't know if you're aware of it, but in Florida, as far as one state is concerned, they have a law that says that people coming from other countries such as Iran or Iraq or the Mideast, they can get a, I think it's a $25,000 tax-free exemption if they want to start a business like a convenience store or something like that. And these types of things, these types of perks are not available to American citizens. And this is one bone of contention that people like myself and probably some black people in that state have with that process. That's just something that was mentioned earlier about how people come here from other countries in the Middle East. But that could be something that they're bothered about. In my case, I am English and Irish, and if you believe what I believe, my people were once the slaves in Egypt. Okay, this happened like 4,000 years ago. So
Too late.
consequently, it's statute of limitations.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm probably owned somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 trillion myself by the Egyptians, and with guilt by association, the Arabs owe me part of that.
I mean,
But,
that just makes the point. These things get so complicated and absurd that it's kind of pointless to start tallying up who owes what.
Anyway, the thing that I would mainly want to tell the blacks in this country that feel they have been dealt a raw deal, I would tell them, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
I should, in just one comment, one more question. Some years ago, I was in a debate with a woman, a black woman, who had a very high position in the Nixon administration. This was kind of the early days of affirmative action when they would really take just anybody. And she mentioned the thing about Korean immigrants given loans, in this case it was $10,000 tax-free loans, and she thought this meant the government gave Koreans $10,000 when they came to the United States. How do you deal with that misunderstanding? Yeah.
Well, I'd like to turn to tactics here. The gravamen of your earlier thrust was, I think, that we deal with this on the basis of IQ differences or as an explanatory factor. But it seems to me in the political culture we're operating, that's extremely sensitive and could backfire, or at least people might refuse to listen. And I want to ask you about two other approaches. Both were suggested by Thomas Sowell. One is germane to the earlier discussion of reparations for whites. In fact, in a recent article in Human Events, Sowell says at the end, perhaps it's the whites who are owed reparations. It seems to me you can begin a debate more easily by focusing on that the damage to whites and the help that whites.
You don't think that would be incendiary?
Not as, it wouldn't harm the self-esteem as much directly as IQ. But the other point I wanted to make is also derived from Sowell's earlier work. That is, we live in unfortunately, a culture dominated by what's called multiculturalism, right, and diversity. Why not focus on black culture and emphasize that as the source of the disparities and take advantage of that context, turn it back on its head?
Well, once again, that will be, about 40% as inflammatory as talking about IQ differences, and then will become as 100% inflammatory when you start raising the question, why do these cultural differences exist? And then you kind of push that back and you're back to IQ differences. I don't think it would be, there's two things to remember. First of all, the truth is true. That's the thing about the truth. Since this is the cause of the differences that are deplored, you just have to say that or your case is going to fall apart like a house of cards. And in general, to say, no, we don't owe you reparations, you owe us reparations, perpetuates the sore head mindset that gets this whole thing going. That it would be much, much better to say, look, what happened, happened. I will do you the favor of not really getting into the question of why this really is the case, but I will generously avert my eyes and call us even as of right this minute. Yeah, thank you.